Without further ado, may I please introduce your chair and co-host for this evening, Angela Kidner.
Many thanks, Rachel, for your introduction, and to you and all the other people who've worked behind the scenes to make this lecture series possible. We're also very grateful to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and for our other sponsors for all their financial support, and to those of you who've donated too. And welcome to you, our audience. Even though we're not physically together, it is a great pleasure to know that you are all here and share an interest in Twickenham's rich cultural heritage. As you may know, we were planning a series of events on gardens and grottos for the annual Twickenham Festival, which was scheduled for June 2020. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic meant that the festival could not go ahead. But a number of historic venues in Twickenham decided to work together to share our enthusiasm for the people and places of this most genteel suburb of Bohemia. We created this virtual lecture series to showcase the Twickenham Luminaries. Each lecture stands on its own, but if you attend more than one, you will discover all sorts of surprising connections between our luminaries. Now, I am delighted to welcome tonight's speaker. Judith has given me a very modest account of herself, but I shall ad-lib just a little. Judith Hawley is Professor of English at Royal Holloway, University of London. She is a frequent contributor to radio and TV programmes on a range of literary and cultural subjects. She says that one of her proudest moments occurred when Lucy Worsley sat on her lap. I think this might be worth a question later. Judith is, of course, a trustee on Pope's Grotto Preservation Trust, contributing both her huge expertise, boundless energy to our project to preserve the grotto for future generations. Her talks and appearances, often in 18th century costume at our fundraising events, have enthused and informed our many supporters. This lecture series owes much to her verve and commitment. In her talk tonight, she will attempt to reconstruct the interior of Pope's Villa, a building that was destroyed over 200 years ago. I can't wait to see inside. Over to you, Judith.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to Rachel for organising this series. So my subject today is the home and workplace of the 18th century satirist Alexander Pope. And Pope, in case you don't know, was the most important British poet between Milton and Wordsworth. He was born in 1688 and died in his villa in Twickenham in 1744. I'm going to begin by reflecting for a moment on why it is that writers and artists' houses have become so popular. Why is it that we want to know more about our writers through their dwelling places? Some critics have been rather sceptical about this. Simon Goldhill asked, what would you really learn by staring at Martin Amos's desk or Philip Roth's kitchen table? So, you know, this banal aspect of their life clearly can't tell you anything about their imagination. Nicola Watson, who's a very interesting critic and historian of the phenomenon of visiting houses, is sceptical too, but she says that houses are associated with the writer, provided a fitting habitation for the individual and collective imagination. So individual visitors to writers' houses have a sense of connection with them, and also the houses become sites for the public. I mean, they attract public funding, public events. As a nation or a community, we can celebrate our writers through preserving their houses. Pope's house in Twickenham was a celebrated site even while he was alive, and after his death, and it went through various hands, it was already on the sort of tourist trail. Here's an interesting book called A Peep into the Principal Seats and Gardens in and About Twickenham, The Residence of the Muses. And this is a book by Joel Henrietta Pye. And she mentions Pope in passing. So you could actually go on a sort of a day trip or even take a long weekend traveling around this sort of Arcadia of Twickenham, visiting a number of different houses. unlike some of the other houses we're hearing about this week, Turner's House, Strawberry Hill, or Marble Hill House, we can no longer peep into Pope's villa. The main building no longer survives. We still have the grotto, but the grotto isn't quite in the state that it was when Pope was alive, though we are working hard to preserve it in its current state to make sure it doesn't degrade anymore. But why has villa, why does it no longer exist, given that he was such a celebrated writer before and after his lifetime? Was it subject to fire, the ravages of time? No, the story is actually more disturbing than that. Pope's villa was a victim of his popularity. He complained that even when he was alive, people would beat a path to his door. And there's a wonderful extract from his long poem, An Epistle to Arbuthnot. Arbuthnot was a good friend of his. Shut the door, good John, fatigued, I said. Tie up the knocker, say I'm sick, I'm dead. John was John Searle, his servant. He's saying, don't open the door to these people anymore. And then he goes into rhapsody. What walls can guard me or what shades can hide? They pierce my thickets, through my grots they glide. By land, by water, they renew the charge. They stop the chariot and they board the barge. So even after his death in 1744, so many people came to his house that the person who bought it in 1807, Baroness Howe, couldn't be doing with it. So she decided the best thing to do was simply knock the villa down. She knocked the villa down completely to the ground, leaving only the grotto as a convenient underpass to her garden on the other side of the road. So celebrated was this destruction that another of our luminaries, J.M.W. Turner, painted this view of Pope's villa at Twickenham during its dilapidations. He also wrote a really rather bad poem about it. But we know a lot about what Pope's villa looked like from the river. There are numerous paintings because he was such a celebrated writer and such an important figure. Lots of people did paintings and then engraved them. There are well over 50. He sometimes refers to the interior and contents in letters to his friends. And there's another very important source. After he died, when the contents of his house were being valued for probate purposes, the clerk went round with, I can imagine him with a clipboard and a pencil tucked behind his ear, using very, very bad spelling, describing and enumerating what was in every single room of the house. So that's given us quite a lot of information of what the house was like. And later in this talk, I'm going to give you a sneak preview of a digital reconstruction that an expert called Paul Richards is doing in association with the Trust. He's making a virtual Arcadia. And before too long, we'll actually be able to visit Pope's villa in digital form. And if you check the Pope's Grotto website, you'll find out when that is. It's not going to be for a couple of years, but we'll let you know. So let me go back just a little bit to the time just before Pope moved to Twickenham. He moved here in 1719, having been born in 1688. How and why did this poet move here? How could he afford it? He actually made quite a substantial sum of money from translating Homer's The Iliad. It made him enough money that he could afford to build his own house. And at first, his friend Richard Boyle, the third Earl of Burlington, encouraged him to build on a plot behind Burlington House. Burlington was parcelling up the land behind what's now the Royal Academy and selling it off in plots. And one of Burlington's favourite architects, Colin Campbell, drew up plans for a house. But Pope, I think, found it far too expensive for him, but also, I think, didn't really want to live in central London. And he actually wasn't really allowed. One thing that still surprises me today is that Pope, who was a Roman Catholic, was subject to all sorts of legal restrictions. Catholics were greatly distrusted in Britain because of the Jacobite rebellion. There'd been a rebellion in 1715 and new laws were brought in saying Catholics could not own land, they couldn't go to universities, they couldn't join the professions, and they were supposed to live 10 miles away from court, and that would be St. James's Palace. Now, Twickenham isn't quite 10 miles away from the centre of London, but it's far enough out to feel removed from these strictures. He couldn't buy the land because of the illegal restrictions, but his friend Thomas Vernon, who was a major Twickenham landowner, leased him this plot on the Thames. So let's have a look at the site now. This is a wonderful view that many Twickenham people will know. Beautiful panorama that now hangs, I think, in the Orleans House Gallery, which we heard about in another of these talks. And this view was painted round about 1725, so after Pope moved here. Now, it's not impossible that Pope commissioned or owned this painting. In the inventory of his house, we're told that there was a Tillman's landscape on one of his walls. Let us zoom in. This gives you the beautiful setting, and it shows you something of the appeal of Twickenham in those days. Not that it's not appealing now, but it was even more lovely then. So here's a detail which depicts the villa as it would have been around about 1725 or so. So let's have a look at it. If we work from the bottom up, on the very bottom level, you can see a big dark arch. That is the entrance to the tunnel and grotto that went underneath his villa, under the road, which is quite a busy road, through to his garden, his important 5-acre garden on the other side of the road. There are steps leading up on either side of the grotto entrance to a sort of little a doorway with pilasters, so it's almost flush with the wall. And there are 4 stories, including this basement story, 2 main stories, and then one on top. This riverfront frontage faces sort of eastish. On the right of the painting, there's the north side, which had beautiful balconies and large windows overlooking. You had a view of the curve of the Thames, and you could look through to Twickenham village. Now, who built this? Pope was a great one for sketching things out on the backs of scraps of paper. And he was constantly sort of fantasizing little buildings and plans for himself. It's possible that he sketched something out, but then he worked with a very important and famous architect, James Gibbs. James Gibbs was also a Catholic, but he kept his religion more private. He's been called the favourite architect of the Tories, 18th century Tories. He designed, for example, the Radcliffe Camera in Oxford and the Senate House in Cambridge. Now, those of you who've lived in a house for any length of time will know that part of the pleasure of it and kind of an addiction is remodelling. Oh, I wonder if so-and-so's just on their side return. I'm thinking about maybe wouldn't our kitchen look so much better if it was bigger, or the kids are outgrowing their bedrooms. Perhaps we should go up into the loft. And Pope was no different. So as soon as he'd got the house and grotto and gardens to a state he liked, he started planning additions, improvements and extensions. And he worked this time with William Kent, another very influential architect, and also, like Pope, a great garden designer whose enormous and gardens have been very, very influential around the world. And here's a view from 1755 of the grotto as it was remodelled with the help of Kent. And I'm going to find you a better detail, a more detailed view of it. So this is a view from 1735, and I'm really fond of this view because you can see a boat arriving up the Thames. A lot of visitors would have come that way, people climbing out of the boat, and Pope in teeny tiny figure just about silhouetted in front of the grotto entrance, welcoming his guests. And he's got various dogs. He had all these big dogs who are always called Bounce, who are coming out to meet the guests. The main improvement here, or the main change, is a portico that he's built in front of the door. And it does several things. He's built 2 rooms on either side of the door out at the front of the villa, which are still there. They form these new chambers in the grotto, and they have little windows. And then there's a terrace on front of those 2 rooms with balustrades around it, with pillars, and then another sort of balcony on top. And then the strange things are angled pieces on either side of the rooms, which we're not quite sure what they are. They might be cold frames or something for the garden. But one effect of that is it means that there are no longer any stairs approaching the main door from the front garden. So in order to get into the house from this side, you would have to go through the grotto, and Pope would take you on a tour through the grotto, pointing out its many features. And then you'd go through a little staircase, and you'd actually end up going up the back stairs from the kitchen into the house. There was also an entrance via the balconies on the right-hand side of the house, and then also from the main road. Now, so those are the details and the sort of physical approach to the house, but let's think about what they signify in cultural terms in the 18th century. The house in this view is substantial. It's grander than the little cottages on either side of it, but it's not as grand as the great houses being built by the noblemen, by the Whig grandees, by Robert Walpole, for example. It's comparatively modest. It also looks much more symmetrical and ordered than the cottages on either side of it, but it's not really symmetrical enough, I think. It's something odd about it. Burlington and Kent were not happy with the portico. I think they thought it was really clunky, and if we were to zoom in very carefully, you would see just the details are inelegant. Often Pope's house is described as Palladian, but it's not really, strictly speaking, Palladian. Let's put it next to one of its Palladian neighbours, and this is a house that many of you will know. So this is a slightly grainy image of both houses, but this is Marble Hill House next to Pope's Grotto. Now, the whole point of Palladian architecture is that it's symmetrical, and also that it's rigorously unadorned. It doesn't have too many fancy details. And if you look at Marble Hill House, it's got this classic Palladian thing of a central block, 3 windows, flanked by 2 bays with 1 window each. That there are lots of squares, there are cube forms, either squares or half squares, and also that there's a straight line at the roof there. You can compare that to Pope's house. It's got some of those features, the central bay with 3 windows, the recessed bays with 1 window each. But the sides have got 3 stories. The centre's got 4. The bays are set down and back, and then this is rather awkward balustrade on the top. There's also quite a lot of ornament. There are these coins, I think they're called, these sort of chunky brickwork along the side. Later on, he made the entrance to the grotto look much more rustic with rough stones that Kent put in. So it's not, strictly speaking, Palladian. It's also, it was described by another of Pope's neighbours as small and bad, and that was by Horace Walpole. We've heard about him and Strawberry Hill. I think the house was built to his proportions and in some ways in his image. So the house embodies him in some way. He designed it for himself. Now, some of you will know already that Pope was a very small man. He was about 4'5", which is 1.3 meters. He also suffered from very early age from a progressive disease called Pott's disease, which was a tuberculosis of the spine, which meant that he didn't develop to full height and his spine became increasingly curved. It left him with living in constant pain, a great deal of physical difficulty. And also it made him subject to ridicule. He's constantly having to defend himself in rhyme. I think there's a way in which this house, with its sort of Lilliputian scale, and it's imposing but also slightly idiosyncratic features, tells us something about how Pope saw himself and how he saw himself in relation to the world. There's a lovely line in one of his imitations of Horace, when he talks about his little house with trees a row and like its master, very low. So the house was a version of himself. It's not just a house, it's a villa. And what do I mean by a villa? A villa is a kind of classical ideal of a house that's part of an estate, so it's on land that can sustain it. Pope's poems are full of references to his artichokes and broccoli and the things that he was growing. He liked to feel that he was independent. It's also a place of retreat. You retire from the city, you move up river to Twickenham, but not necessarily to retire from work altogether, but to draw back so that you can recoup your energies and then launch yourself again into society. And that is what Pope did. He retired from politics for a while. In the 1730s, he came back very strongly as the centre of the opposition against Robert Walpole. He also entertained friends there, and that's a very important idea of the classical villa, that Cicero had a kind of Tusculan sort of seminar series practically. His friends came and stayed and they discussed things. I think of Pope's villa as being a kind of, forget the bump, a Wikipedia, if I may. So I imagine Pope's villa as this place where he's created it for himself and for his friends. Now we've got a very good view of the front, the river frontage. We know nothing at all about the back yet, and we don't know what went on inside. Let me try to imagine Pope's villa. And here I'm going to move to the project I mentioned, the virtual Arcadia project that Paul Richens has been developing. So it's a digital recreation of a moving image of arriving up the river and being greeted by the villa and entering and being able to travel around the rooms. So I'm going to show you some of the slightly rough images. These are very much work in progress, but I think you'll get some extraordinary surprises, some things that very few people have seen since the middle of the 18th century. So we can get our bearings. This is Paul Richens' digital image of the approach up the Thames. It's very like the images we've seen so far. And this is the after Kent's portico has been built and it's been slightly rusticated. So imagine that you're coming in your little boat and you're pulling in, and we're just going to pull in slightly to the right of the house on the north side, and we're not docking on the lawn. We're pulling up to a kind of slipway at the side of the house. You can see that there's rough panelling. So Pope was very, very close to tradesmen and working class neighbours. You can see here the north side of the house with these two beautiful balconies. And we're imagining now that we're going up the side of the house, and then we're going to turn left, and we're going to see the road side of the house, which has never been seen before. But we're going to see it from a slightly odd view. And this is where it's even more work in progress. We don't have the colour and the beautiful details that Paul has created for us there. So imagine now that we've risen above the house, that maybe we're a bird that's flown over from Pope's garden, just the other side of the road, and we're approaching the house from the west and slightly above it. The funny white triangle you can see on the image is the entrance to the grotto as it comes into the garden, as it goes under the road and comes into the garden. And this is what Paul thinks the road side of the house would have looked like. It would have been right up against the road. So it's extraordinary. As I say, no one has ever done this before. And what Paul has also tried to do, and this is something that really fascinates me, he takes us inside the house. And so I'm now going to show you a couple of slightly grainy images, but a kind of like an architect's cross-section of the house. So imagine that wall that we just looked at, the roadside, and you take that wall away. This is what Paul thinks it might have looked like inside. And he's worked this out by following, among other things, Gibbs' book on houses, and so he knows where the load-bearing walls are and the thicknesses of the walls, the likely placing of the staircases and things. But also, do you remember that clerk who took the inventory for probate purposes of Pope's property, and he's followed his journey through. So if we go, I don't know if you can see number 3 there, that's the room that the clerk describes as the room next the road. Then we have number 4, the garret staircase. And on this staircase, number 4, going down, there were several large pictures and also a model of Burlington House, the current Royal Academy. And we have number 7 on the north side. There might have been, this is conjectural, a long room with windows on 3 sides, which is known as the best room fronting the Thames. We also have the library, and I think this is room 11 below it. So Pope's library probably was on the west side, overlooking the garden rather than overlooking the river. The garden was absolutely important to him. We have the back stairs, and we also have, it's misnumbered 17, I think that's the little parlour. And then those arches at the bottom are the vaults which were incorporated into the grotto. I hope this is making sense to you. I'm going to show you a view from the other side. So this is as if we'd taken off the front of the house facing the river. Among other things here, we have number 5 was described in the inventory as the chintz room. Now that's usually taken to mean the Chinese room, and Chinese furnishings are very, very popular, but it might also have been chintz with a TZ, we don't know. We have the best room fronting the Thames again. We have a best staircase. We have a parlour, number 10 is a parlour, and a parlour was often used as an eating room. And there's also a little parlour, and a 15 in the basement is the kitchen. Now, Pope was entertaining guests here all the time. Lots of friends came. Among the most important guests ever to come were Jonathan Swift and John Gay. And in 1726, Swift, Pope, John Gay, various other friends, Bolingbroke, Dr. John Arbuthnot, all gathered in this house and worked on their separate writing projects. Gulliver's Travels was finished in this house. And so I wanted to know about the interior to think, well, where were they writing? How big was this house? Were there enough rooms for these creative people to set up a space to work on their own? How would they have socialized? How would they have worked together? So I tried to find a sense of, I could place them in some of these rooms. There's enough room for each of them to stay overnight, to have their own table and chairs to work at. And then I thought, what would it feel like inside? We've got the bare structure here, but what might it look like? And I found an appropriately Lilliputian image for you. And this is an image of a doll's house, which was probably made not for children, but just a doll-sized house. And it's based on Gibbs's instructions for architecture. All the proportions are the same. Again, it's much more classically symmetrical. But there are lots of features in this house which really match up with the description of furnishings and room usage in Pope's inventory. There's a parlour, a chintz room, and so on. This gives me a kind of slightly humorous sense of what it might have been like. I've got some more details of sort of adult-sized furniture in a moment, but I can't take you through all the rooms. We really would be here all night. I'm just going to take you through a couple of rooms. So let's think about the best room. And this was this was a long room. There's either the one facing north towards Twickenham or the one on the main floor that opened onto the Thames and gave onto the balustraded, the portico. And this room contained, among other things, 6 portraits in gold frames, including one of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who by then was no longer a friend. A pink and silver settee. Wow! Who knew? 6 walnut chairs, 3 marble tables, a pier glass in a gold frame, a large French carpet, 4 glass sconces, window curtains, and a camp bed. It's the camp bed for an extra guest, maybe, or for one of Pope's servants. And I looked through a number of 18th century architectural books, and I found an image which I think might give you some impression here. This is the saloon at Erdig House in Wales, and it was decorated in the 1720s by a bachelor, and Pope never married. So it doesn't have a lady's taste in it. It has gilt-framed mirrors, the pier glasses, and it also has, I'll pick out a couple of details. I think this is possibly richer than Pope. I don't know if Pope had the chandelier, but he certainly had sconces, and we see sconces there, had clocks. The inventory lists 12 walnut chairs. Maybe they were like this. The silver and pink settee could have been very like this one here. And for some reason, silver and pink were colours associated with taking tea. So I imagine Pope and Swift and John Gay writing in their separate rooms and coming together in the afternoon to sit and take tea on a sofa like this. Here's a Chinese room from the same house, Chinese wallpaper, Chinese bed. It's possible that Pope's mother, his beloved mother Edith, had the Chinese room, unless perhaps she had a cottage next door. We don't entirely know. Or Swift stayed here maybe when he was the honoured guest in 1726 and 1727. I mentioned that on the garret staircase there was a model of Burlington House, and here's a recently made model, so it might have been something like that. Now this is my final room, and then I'm going to leave you to your own devices. He referred in a letter from around 1742 to my golden apartment at Twickenham, where I sit like Apollo encompassed in my own gilding under 4 pillars of the Doric order on a throne of flame-coloured damask, where you may come and behold me in the fullness of my glory and majesty, wanting nothing but the laurel which you may find at Kibber's. So the laurel was the laurel wreath that Colley Kibber was the poet laureate. So he's imagining himself. So he's in a real house with real gilding, his own gilding that he's made. He's got his own columns, but he's imagining himself in this state of grandeur with his friends coming to visit him. And I wonder if this chair might have looked something like this. This is from a much earlier portrait. So this is a picture of his friend Charles Jervis from before he moved to Twickenham, but again, a red chair. And he's sitting, you know, he was a very crooked man sitting uncomfortably, but with his head in his hand, musing away. The person behind him is perhaps a servant coming to tie back the curtains, or his muse. This is a picture of a man reveling in his imagination. And that imagination, I'll argue, is embodied in his house. And there I will leave you. Thank you.
Judith, thank you very much. That was amazing. It was a brilliant and informative talk, and it's actually opened a huge new dimension on Alexander Pope. We've known such a lot about his writing, and he's obviously famous for that, but to picture him in his own home is somehow extremely special. Thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.
We have a number of questions. If any of you are wanting to ask one, there's a reminder that you will need to do so via the chat function. Click on the button in the controls bar, which looks like a speech bubble, and the host's name will come up. Click the arrow next to Rachel's name, select mine, Angela Kidner. There are 1 or 2 coming in now. No picture of the grotto, somebody says.
No, yeah, do you want me to mention that now? I thought the grotto is so much better known, and you can also visit the grotto physically. I've done talks on the grotto, and other people have too, but in 20 minutes I thought I would show you an aspect of Pope that we don't know about. Yeah.
It provoked quite a number of questions. So in fact, if I group a few of them together about houses, one very interesting one, where villas only built on one bank of the river, the other side is so bucolic, where we see the boats being... Yes,
that is a good question. I don't know that so much. Isn't there a story that that the respectable people lived on one side and the mistresses on the other? Pope is lucky not to have any building on the side opposite him, and there also were the 8 little islands which govern where you can build. But there are villas on both sides, aren't there?
No. In fact, if I may put in there, I think that was the towing bank. That's where the rude, rough hailers towed their barges along, probably with very bad language. So maybe that's why.
That's interesting, and also that panoramic view, the Tillerman's panoramic view, of course, shows that. You see the houses of leisure and the gentry and the grand on one side, and on the other side you see the workers pulling their barge. Yeah, that's very important. But you also have these working people's houses interspersed with the villas for quite some time. I mean, there's a tanner 2 doors up. It must have been very, very smelly. it was a, there was light industry interspersed all along that riverbank.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the questions actually relates to the Tillermans and questioning where would the house be if it was still there now, questioning its placing, and what are the two islands that are visible at either end of the panorama.
Shall I go back and see if I can find the Tillermans? You can mention the islands, and this is where I confess that I actually live in Clapham. I don't live in Twickenham, so I don't know it as well as you. It's one called Pope's 8, and is the other one Eel Pie Island or not?
You're right. I think it's the Eel Pie Island. I'm not sure about the other 8 because I'm not sure if it's Radnor. So it's around Radnor.
Right.
The house. What she's asking, what house is on that site now?
So what happened was that Baroness Howe flattened the building completely in 1807. She kept the grotto and the tunnel, as I mentioned, and then she built a new house which was slightly to the north and angled slightly differently. So she retained the grotto as a freestanding structure and then built a house. And there are images of it if you Google Baroness Howe's image, and it was a sort of a mock Tudor-Beathan, sort of Swiss cottagey looking, I think absolutely hideous house. Oh no, hers has had bays and was neoclassical, and then that went, and then another house was built, which is this sort of Tudor-Beathan house with half timber and red brick, and that now is a school, a really excellent school, and the grotto exists under the school. We have very, very good relations with them.
And here's a difficult one. Is the Alexander Pope pub built on part of Pope's estate? And was it there when Pope was alive?
Yeah, I think the pub is just off the end of it. I can recommend a really good source, Anthony Beckles-Wilson. It was a great Twickenham historian, has done a beautiful book which you can actually get through the Pope's Grotto Preservation Trust, which has done extraordinary research on who owned each and every little strip of land, and he'll be able to tell you there's a map detailing who lived where. I think the Pope's pub is just slightly south of the boundary. So St. Catherine's School, which is still there, is built on the site of the garden.
We've had a couple of questions about the garden. One is, will the garden be reconstructed digitally? I guess this is.
Oh yes, yes. We couldn't reconstruct it without destroying another very good school. I wouldn't want to do that. Yes, the research that Paul has been doing on 18th century planting techniques and interviewing gardens. We know that Pope had sort of vegetable beds, a cottage garden type thing. He mentioned his broccoli and his asparagus and so on. And she's been doing things like working out, well, okay, would you really plant asparagus that close to a hedge? And where would the wind be coming from? So he's been working out the very, very precise details, and also creating features like Pope's quincunx, which is this little plantation of 5 trees. He's got the grass moving, so that if you imagine you're walking through the garden, you can see the shrubs waving in the wind, and you see little vistas with a statue here and the obelisk to his mother, a mound that his friends used to roll up. The garden creation is really fabulous.
We have a question that says, we understand that a lot of the details came from Gibbs's book. Was it not usual to draw plans for houses, or have these simply been lost over time? I mean, needing the reconstruction that was done by Paul.
Well, if Pope was he was a great recycler. So I've got a great stack of papers on my desk, and I don't know if you do this, that I always use both sides of the paper. I print on the back. And he did this with letters from friends, with drawings and so on. He would, a pile of papers would be on his desk, and then he would flip it over and then start writing on the back. So some of his drawings and things survived because he used them to draft his translation of Homer, of other poems. So sometimes the poems survive because they're what he was working on and gave to his publishers, and accidentally these other bits and pieces survive, like some of his sketches and the sketches of the house. There's some correspondence with Gibbs, but there's not enough to judge whether or not Gibbs formally worked as an architect and drew up a very detailed drawing. But from the way, from the hints in the letters and the way Pope talked about his house, I suspect that he had an idea in his head, sketched out something roughly, and Gibbs tried to turn it into something workable. But I think perhaps because of the scope of it, he didn't have, there are no big surviving architect's drawings and plans which are, you know, housed in an ancestral library. You know, someone like Burlington
No.
keep his plans, but a gentleman like Pope, perhaps that's not the sort of thing he kept. And Jonathan Swift referred to him as paper-sparing Pope.
That's lovely.
Paper, expensive. It was made out of linen. Yeah,
that's true. Yes. 2 questions about Walpole. What did Walpole make of Pope, given Pope's political stance against his father? And in other respects, they seem to share an outlook on houses as expressions of self.
Yeah, it's really interesting that Pope and the Prime Minister Robert Walpole were at odds with each other. Pope, because he was a Catholic, had to be careful. He didn't want to oppose Walpole too strongly. And there's also a rumor, I mean, there's some evidence that Walpole might have paid him off. You know, there's evidence of a meeting between Robert Walpole and Alexander Pope in which Walpole might have given him, you know, 50 guineas and threatened him or something and told him to stop being so outspoken against him. Mm-hmm. Horace Walpole was, as we've heard from Michael Snowdon, was very loyal to his father, but he also was very attracted to Pope as a figure. And I think both of them, bachelors, outsiders, slightly odd and eccentric in their ways, with this sort of very interesting taste. They were very, very similar. And Horace Walpole talked about the ghost of Pope, and he chose his site because he wanted Pope sort of in his vision, really. But Horace Walpole was able to hold in his mind a fondness for both his father and his Whig. And Horace Walpole was a Whig, really. He's a Whig Protestant. But he also loved Pope, the Catholic, and Horace Walpole also loved the trappings of the Catholic Church. You know, a lot of his Gothic taste is to do with medieval Catholicism. So he manages somehow to hold the two together, even though they are really opposite.
Yeah, and they never met, did they? Somebody asked.
No.
So, sadly.
Yeah, that's right. So Pope died in 1744. Horace Walpole, I can't remember his precise dates, but he didn't come to Twickenham until 25 years later, something like that.
Right. It's a very difficult question for you here. Would you be able to draw parallels between Pope's poetry in structure, style, even content, with those of the house?
Yes, I think you can. That couplet that I quoted about trees all a row, the couplet is 2 lines of verse, and it's got this very sort of symmetrical structure that Pope didn't write exclusively in couplets, but 90% of his writing or more is in couplets, and that regularity of form, you see those little windows all matching up, but there are also irregularities, bits that don't meet up. And one of the things that Pope is a complete genius at, and literary critics say this all the time, that he masters the couplet form. So the couplet form is rather mechanical. It's 10 syllables in 2 lines, but you can place the emphasis in different parts of the line. You can divide the line differently. So he creates all sorts of rhythms in the language. Lines echo each other, that this couplet will join up with something that comes later on. So he's working almost like an architect or a designer, sketching out various patterns, sort of sinuous patterns of movement of meaning and feeling within a very organized and regular structure.
Right, thank you. I'm just checking to see if some new questions have just come in. We've been asked when Paul's project will be finished and available. We're hoping next year. Very soon. Yes.
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 I was in correspondence with him yesterday, and he said that the 2 images I had of the front and the side of the house, he said that these are new ones.
Yes.
the architectural diagrams were older. They're from a year ago.
Right, thank you. A question asking about Pope's mother. Did Pope's mother visit the villa?
Pope's mother lived in the villa. So Pope and his family came from Windsor originally, and when the laws against Catholics were coming in, and Pope's father owned some land. Pope's father had been a linen draper in the City of London. They moved up to Windsor, Binfield, where they had other family. The laws came in about the Catholics not owning land. They had to sell it. They moved to Chiswick, and there's a pub up on the Hogarth roundabout, Mawson Villas, I think it is, which has a blue plaque that you can visit. And I can't remember exactly when Pope's father died, but it was, I think was it before or after he moved into the villa? But anyway, Edith, his mother, was a very, very important part of his life and lived in the house with him. And there are lots of letters to and from Pope about his mother's hospitality, and how visitors always asked after Edith and praised his mother as a wonderful old-fashioned hostess, giving such joy to the visitors. Pope's nurse also lived with them. This was quite common for your nanny or nurse, and tragically it was the nurse who gave him his disease. He probably got this tuberculosis from his nurse's milk.
Oh, how sad.
Yeah.
In fact, this is a really good moment to start winding up because we're reaching the end of our time. The upcoming visit to Pope's Grotto is fully booked, sob. How can we find out when the next visit will be?
Yes, please go on the Pope's Grotto Preservation Trust website. We're opening as and when we can at the moment, because COVID restrictions, especially this new rule of 6 and no mingling, as Priti Patel so wonderfully describes it. As I said, we work very closely with the school who now owns it, and they're extremely welcoming and generous. But as you can see, these are difficult times. In normal times, we open about once a month, and then in festivals like the Twickenham Festival, London Open House Weekend. And we also open for private visits if you contact us via our website. Hope to see you. It is a fabulous place.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you all for your questions. And thank you, Judith, for a wonderfully entertaining talk. If you have not already donated, please consider doing so. The pandemic has shown our 5 heritage organisations the importance of cooperation to tackle our collective challenges. And it's also shown us, and I hope all of you, the discoveries and the excitement that working collectively provides. So once again, thank you for coming and good night.